Today on the program, if you are a homeowner or you are a prospective homeowner, if you want to own real estate in Utah, you better watch this episode. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. It is all about our current housing crisis. It's called a crisis because the supply of homes versus the demand of homes is going crazy. Every single month, prices are going up and up and up and up in Utah. It's caused by a number of factors. We're going to go into some of those factors, but we're also going to delve into the growing gap between the rich and the poor, why that's happening, and what I believe we can do to alleviate this housing shortage, the housing crisis that we find ourselves in right now. This has required a ton of research, so please stick with me. It's going to involve some graphs and some data. Could get a little bit dry. If you're new to Utah Stories, we are all about providing the story of Utah. The newspapers provide the what, we provide the how and the why. And by how and why, we delve into history, we delve into economics, we delve into data to explain how and why things are the way they are. But if you're like, oh, I hate history, I hate economics, I'm not watching this, I'm going to play video games instead. If that's your attitude, you are destined to become a pawn for the corporations, for the government, and they are going to manipulate you and force you into doing things that and making a world that you don't want to see. This is about empowering you to get more involved, to be more educated, to make better decisions that actually impact the quality of life here in Utah. That's what we're about in this podcast. That's what Utah Stories Magazine is about. It's about empowering you, the residents of Utah, to better know how to shape Utah into the place that we want to live in. Okay, so with that, let's dive right in. This is the Affordable Housing Report put out by the state of Utah and by Workforce and Housing and Community Development. Let's take a look at some key statistics in this. It's a huge report. I mean, if you could take a look at it in more detail, I suggest you do. But this actually does explain why things are going in the direction they're going. This is a key graph right here. This graph, please bear with me. If you don't like graphs, you really still should look at this one. This is the gross domestic product of Utah. This is the total output in millions of dollars. So I believe that this 80,000 represents, if you put it in millions of dollars, it's something like 80 billion. But so we started out at 80 billion as our gross, or 70 billion as our gross domestic product in 2001. Look where we are today. We're at like $185 billion is our GDP for Utah. And then if you look at this graph down here, this blue graph, this is real wages. Our wages have just crept up a tiny little bit, starting out at about 65 grand in 2001. They went up just a tiny little bit before they collapsed in 2008, and then they went way down in 2011, and now they've gone up just a little bit. So we're up to like $79,000 is our household wages, but look at that compared to the growth of our GDP. Our GDP's gone through the roof, and that's, it's kind of a good thing. We've become way more efficient. Our businesses have become way more profitable, but it's not translated into higher wages, and that's really the major problem. As wages have stagnated, our GDP's gone up. We're attracting more and more people who want to live here because we have one of the hottest economies in the nation. But as a result, our housing supply is tiny and our housing costs have gone crazy. So this represents housing costs and per capita consumption of expenditures related to housing costs and utilities. And we've gone from like $3,700 a month up to nearly $6,800 a month spending in per capita consumption. And I believe that's probably more than just housing utilities, but all things surrounding your home. And that's a crazy amount of money. And so that leads to this statistic that more and more people are finding themselves spending a greater chunk of their income by percentage on housing, so that now we're to the point where 1 in 5 people in Utah is spending more than 50% of their income on housing. You really should be 40% or below on housing if you want to be able to save money to eventually buy a house. And that's what I find so troubling is like, just using myself as an example, I bought a house when I first moved out of my parents' house when I was 19 years old. It was the first thing I was able to do. I got a decent job. I bought a house. I filled it full of roommates, and I lived that way for like 8 years. And my roommates paid my mortgage. It was a great deal. But there's just no way that would be possible today. And for a middle class person in their 20s, you couldn't buy a home. You could maybe buy some condos in the outskirts. I'm trying to think of what I could afford that would be around today. Maybe a mobile home. But I mean, I get the people who are living the van life. Like, why waste all this money, this wealth, on giving it to a landlord and not where you don't have any ability to put money aside to buy your own piece of real estate? Why not just buy a van instead? I totally get it. And so one of the things I think that could alleviate this problem big time is this idea of building tiny home communities. And it's something that's been brought up by our mayor. It's like most homes in Salt Lake County sit on 1/8 of an acre. 1/8 of an acre is actually quite large. You could fit probably about 6 or 7 tiny homes on 1/8 of an acre. If they would simply change the zoning laws, you could take big swaths of land. It's eminent domain is 2 words I absolutely hate, but when you're talking about the need for people to be able to afford to buy a home, I don't think that you take that off the table. I think that there's areas where there's open space where you could create a park in some of the open space, but put a ton of tiny home lots that are a 16th or even like a 32nd of an acre, where people could live in tiny homes and they could own the lot that their tiny home sits on. And there could be a small HOA fee if there's amenities nearby like parks and rivers. But I think people need to own. We don't want to become a nation of renters because it's the number one way to preserve wealth. It's the number one way to climb the socioeconomic ladder. And the number 2 way to climb the socioeconomic ladder is to be able to start a business, to be able to become either a lifestyle entrepreneur or to become a legitimate small business owner. And by lifestyle entrepreneur, so I've found some statistics related to small businesses in this country. There's actually 30.2 million small businesses, but the percentage of small businesses that are 1 person or 2 people is actually about half that number. And I consider that to become being called lifestyle entrepreneurs, where it's just you, 1 other person, maybe your wife, maybe you run like a little backyard urban farm, as we talked about in 2 issues ago of Utah Stories magazine, or you run a little cottage industry making bath and body products, as we've written about. Beehive Naturals, a company in Ogden, does that. Or you run a restaurant. I mean, if it's just you and your family, I think that is a big part of the American dream. And it's this ability to say, okay, we want this lifestyle. We want to save up so we can live the lifestyle we want to have. And that's about half of all small businesses in this country. And small businesses have been decimated due to COVID restrictions. Okay, so due to COVID, there have been thousands upon thousands upon thousands of small business closures in this country because, like I said in a previous episode, they provided these PPP loans and these EIDL loans, but you really needed to be sophisticated. You needed to be working with a banker to be able to qualify. And most of the money did not make it to Main Street, did not make it to the ma and pa businesses because they just didn't have the level of sophistication to apply for the programs. And so thousands have closed in Utah alone. It's estimated by the Salt Lake Tribune 400 restaurants have gone under. I mean, and that's terrible because restaurants provide the fabric of our communities. When you think about your community, what do you think about first? You think about your small local restaurants, and 400 of them are gone now. And a lot of them are just teetering, just trying to keep open because they can't find the labor force they need to reopen due to these idiotic stimulus programs to keep people at home instead of working. I won't go into that right now. But what COVID did was it gave the government a mandate to destroy small businesses that were non-essential and to help, to a great extent, all these giant big box stores, big, huge corporate retailers, big, huge corporations that were considered essential, and they got windfall profits. It's like Amazon just went through the roof. Walmart did incredibly well. Every single fast food chain you could imagine did amazingly well during COVID. And unfortunately, thousands of small businesses across the nation have gone under. What does this really mean, though, and why should we worry about it? So half of our economy is made up of large corporations. There's like 15,000 of them. Half of our economy is made up of small businesses and lifestyle entrepreneurs. There's like 30.2 million of them. The reason why this matters is decentralization of power is what enables a free market to flourish. When power becomes more centralized, what do you think these giant corporations do with their power? What do you think they do with all these profits, all this power? Well, they hire lobbyists. They hire lobbyists to help them regulate the competition out of existence. And if you know anything about what actually happens at the Utah State Legislature or in Washington, of course, most of the legislators don't read these bills. And most of these bills are copycat bills that are also passed in other state legislatures. They are mandates of regulation of giant corporations saying you should mandate this A, B, C, and D so that these smaller entities cannot infringe upon our mega profits that we're receiving every year. And according to Charlie Munger, who's Warren Buffett's partner, this is called building a moat around your profits. And this is what every giant corporation does because they want to provide their shareholders the most consistent dividends. They want to protect their profit shares, their market share, and they want to continue to pay off their investors with generous dividends. And so that's what they do. And that is at the detriment of small businesses. And just to show you what I'm talking about, this is a Harvard Business Review study. I decided to just type in a comparison of small businesses growth with giant corporation growth over the past decade. This is what I found. This article popped up. The gap between large and small companies is growing. Why? Why is it happening? It's happening for a couple of reasons. First of all, the size in large businesses is growing exponentially, as we've seen in the NASDAQ. Just to show you what's happened in the NASDAQ, it was at a low of 1,300 in February 7th, 2009. Now we're all the way up to 15,000 with the NASDAQ. That's 1,000% increase over an 11-year period in the NASDAQ Composite Index, which is mostly technology companies. But we look at what's happened with why this has happened. It's because these giant tech companies are investing more and more money in R&D, and they're investing more and more money into acquisitions. So if you remember when Instagram was this cool little company startup, everybody's moving over to Instagram, and then the next thing you know, it's like, oh, Facebook just bought Instagram because they were a competitor. And the same happened with, I believe, WhatsApp was bought out by Facebook as well. And so they centralize their power. They create these moats so that nobody can trample on their profit shares. And they're highly efficient and effective at doing this. And they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in the meantime, it's getting much, much more difficult for small businesses to bridge this gap and become large businesses. The performance gap between the large and the small is increasing. And so it's just not, our economy is operating in a completely different manner than it ever has before. If you imagine when the tech startups, when the whole tech boom began, it was like Microsoft, Apple, Dell computers. They were started in garages by guys who just kind of saw what was happening, and they totally overtook IBM. And then IBM stuck around for a while, but it was like, do you ever hear about IBM anymore? They just dominated. But rather than that model of these small little businesses, startups bootstrapped out of garages competing, it's just not happening very much anymore. So now I want to get into how that impacts what we're seeing in the growing gap between the rich and the poor. So I think what's happened here in Utah with our housing prices, with our tech economy booming, is we've minted all these tech millionaires. They're buying the best properties. They can afford to buy single family homes. The supply is now at an all-time low in Utah. The demand is at an all-time high. And so everybody in the service sector, everyone who is not a tech, doesn't have a high-paying tech job of six figures, is now being priced out of the market. And so, whereas if you were lower middle class, like I was 20 some odd years ago, and I could afford to buy a home, now you are essentially taken down a rung in that socioeconomic ladder. Whereas if you middle class, which would be considered, 50, 60 grand a year, you can't afford to buy a home anymore. You got to wait until you're 30 or 40. I just think that's terrible. And I think that the main thing we need to do now is change our zoning laws to enable people to own property, smaller lots if it's closer to the city, and then as we go further, allow for denser housing, more developments, and the loosening of zoning restrictions, because that's really the driver of supply. We just need more supply so we can meet the demand. Will demand ever diminish? Unfortunately, I cannot say that I see that happening anytime soon here in Utah, because California, we pointed out in a previous episode, is making such stupid decisions, driving so many people out, as is Washington. The cities all along the western coast are driving thousands upon thousands of people out, and they're coming to mostly like Austin and Texas. A lot of people are moving to Arizona and Nevada and Vegas. But then a lot of people are coming here to Utah. And here in Utah, the main thing that's also keeping supply super low is people are not leaving. People are staying here like never before. So that's about it. I think that provide all these links to these reports, and so you can check it out for yourself. This was actually a pretty interesting article from LinkedIn, Small Business Statistics and Demographic Trends That Will Shape the New Decade. It's really about how small businesses are, how it's reshaping in the economy. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot, because when you consider how we affect change in this world, like how do you as an individual or an individual small business owner actually affect change, it's really only due to decentralization. When power is too centralized and our political leaders feel like they're only working for these giant corporations who are funding their campaigns, we lose our voice. Whereas if we decentralize our economies more, and we support small independent businesses more and more, our economy becomes way more decentralized, and it allows these smaller entities to have a bigger piece of the political leaders' ear and a bigger presence in their minds than if the giant corporations give them all their money and provide them all their support, and therefore they give them all the power they want to rewrite our laws in favor of their businesses. And so I think that's about it. I'll provide links to this show and all the research that I've done. And if you will, give this video, if you like this content, a thumbs up, and please subscribe to our channel. But the very best way you can support us as well is go out, either subscribe to our print magazine. This was our issue all about farms in Utah disappearing. This was June, and this is our current issue now, all about the pioneers of Utah, both tech pioneers and Mormon pioneers. Really what tech pioneers in Utah are doing, driving the tech industry today. And really fun articles, great articles. Will Utah run out of water? an incredibly important subject and how we can serve. And I think you'll really enjoy it. So get the Voice of Local Utah, fill it out right here on our website, utahstories.com, or subscribe to the print magazine right here. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Support our sponsors of this program, which are Canyon Meadows Grass-Fed Beef and Green Bike SLC. We don't read the commercials anymore because we count on you clicking on their logos on our website, clicking on their logos from our digital newsletter, and support us by supporting them. And you tell them that you found them from utahstories.com, and that's a big boost for us as well. Okay, so finally, thank you so much for watching. This has been Rich Markosian. I'll see you next time.